Are we ready for just war, my friend?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. This will be interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Chuck, it's a pleasure. It's an honor to be with you today. We're talking about one of the chapters that I think to me is one of the most interesting segments of medieval thought, and how some of the ideas from the medieval period interact with our own sensibilities and ideas in this modern and even postmodern period now. And that's the idea in Christendom of the concept of just war. And we'll have a lot to say about the medieval thinkers here, but I think maybe, Chuck, it's helpful at least to just start describing the lay of the land in our own day so that we can have some context to relate back to these medieval thinkers. And I think if there's any one area where I have felt Christians seem to have one of the hardest uphill battles, let's say, in the court of public opinions, in the marketplace of ideas, let's say, it's this idea of a proper place for violence, bloodshed, warfare. And people in our day might even wince at that characterization. Perhaps maybe the right thing to do or think is to say there's never a proper place for violence or bloodshed, certainly for war as it's been traditionally prosecuted and executed throughout history. So it's a very interesting chapter to me. And I think Christians do have an answer. And I think we have an answer that we can not apologize for. But at the same point in time, we don't just want to step into a position that's easily caricatured. And so that's why I appreciated this is Professor Frederick Russell. I appreciated Professor Russell's chapter. And just kicking things off, Chuck, how have you interacted with this idea when you've had some discussions with folks, and maybe what's some of your own personal background that you bring to the idea?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with you that this is a really interesting topic. And one of the things that I just found really interesting, and it's backed up some of the things that I thought about in the past, is this area of just war and the philosophy of what is a just war. There is so much from the medieval era that still applies in the way we think about just war today. And obviously, there are some more modern formulations. But if we compare some of the other things that we've been reading about in ethics and theology and things like that, and how the medievals philosophized, there's been a lot more change, right? The role of the individual self and various things, the way we think about metaphysics and those kinds of things. There's been significant change. But when it comes to just war, I think it's fair to say that you can draw a straight line to some of the discussions that are had in the medieval era and even in late antiquity to the way we talk about them today. And for that matter, Christian thinkers in this area still have a great amount of influence, maybe not always recognized as Christian thinkers, but there is a great deal of influence. So that's one thing. As far as my personal background in this is actually something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. I think I've mentioned in some of our previous discussions that my parents were converts to Christianity. My dad really a convert to Christianity from really nothing. My mom converted from Catholicism to Protestantism, and those two different stories do tend to frame a little bit about how they think about those things. But in the course of their radically breaking from their previous ways of thinking, they became Christian pacifists. And through their whole lives, they've been proponents of Christian pacifism. And so growing up in that family, obviously that's not a majority position. It's definitely not a majority position in the Reformed world, in the Dutch Reformed world. In fact, in our denomination, the Christian Reformed Church, just war theory has been the subject of a great deal of study, and denomination itself has determined that some version of just war is the sort of official position of the denomination. And so my parents' position being different from that was interesting. And it became very practical as well. My dad's brother, who also is Reformed, he attends a Christian Reformed church in South Dakota now. And at the time of this, what I'll be telling you about, what he was member of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, but he was drafted during the late stages of the Vietnam War. My dad avoided that, but his brother got drafted. And his brother actually ended up serving as a conscientious objector during that era because of his pacifism. And despite the fact that the Orthodox Presbyterian Church also is a proponent of the just war theory, but he was able to do that and was one of very few. There were very few conscientious objectors during the Vietnam era who received honorable discharges, and he did. He received an honorable discharge at the end of his term. Most conscientious objectors got dishonorable discharges or some other sort of discipline, but he didn't. But so that background meant then that as a teenager, as I first started thinking about these things, and in the 1980s, where we were very much thinking about communism and nuclear war and East versus West and some of the proxy wars that were going on, and thinking a lot about what is a just war and when is it appropriate to get involved. And I had come initially to the conclusion that just war theory made more sense to me. And in fact, I remember as a law student in the early 90s, I spent a year working in a clinical program, legal aid to institutionalized persons, where we would, as part of this program, we worked with people in prisons and try to deal with some of the legal issues that sometimes arise, family law and things like that, that sometimes arise as a result of people being in prison. And one of the things that we did as part of that is we also got involved in victim offender reconciliation type programs. And the leader of that part of this clinical program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School at the time was a Mennonite, a very committed Christian, but very committed. The Mennonites are Christian pacifists, and had very lengthy discussions with him about Christian pacifism and his views on it and Mennonite views on it. In many ways, even though my parents were or are very reformed in their theology, when it came to this issue, they tended to be they tended to be closer to some of the Mennonite type thinkers on some of these issues. And just lengthy discussions. And it didn't really necessarily change my mind. I describe myself today as a proponent of a narrow just war theory, meaning that I do believe in the just war theory. I tend to apply it rather narrowly. So if we were to talk about specific wars, some just war theorists might find certain wars to be just and others not to be just, and they may not necessarily always agree. And my tendency is I've tended to find that I tend to be on the narrower end of that there are fewer of them that I, looking back, consider to be justified, but still believe that there is some level of just war. And interestingly, a lot of the concepts that come up as early as Augustine, but then throughout this time, as talking about what constitutes a just war, and things like authority, things like what is the attitude of those, even issues like how do we deal with civilians in the course of a war, are all the same kinds of issues that when I talk to my fellow just war theorists and we're discussing whether a particular war or a particular type of war might be just or not, it is those very issues that we end up spending a lot of time talking about. What is the authority? At what point can we say that a particular war has the sufficient authority for a nation to engage in it? And what are the practices as part of a war that that could turn what began as a just war into an unjust war, including things like the attitudes of the heart that come as part of the war and those kinds of things. So it's a concept, it's an idea that I've spent a lot of time I'll say maybe not even reading so much about, but actually just discussing, just talking over with people, and including a number of my friends. Just the last time we got together, my college roommates and we got together right before the COVID lockdowns, summer of 2019, and it was again one of those issues we spent quite a bit of time talking about and just discussing where are we at, and a friendly discussion, and but not always agreeing. And all of us, I would say, all of us in that group fit within the Reformed tradition, slightly different Reformed traditions, but all of us having that discussion about where we are on those issues. It's a really interesting discussion, but in many ways, it also has some great importance because we do end up dealing with these things in real life at times, as my uncle did as well. So real interesting stuff. How about you? I'm interested in your background in this discussion as well.
Yeah. Thanks for asking, Chuck, and thank you for that overview. I think it really makes a good description of the major points in the landscape of our discussion. And I think maybe as a first step, I want to share with you that I've been very impressed from non believers who have articulated maybe not perhaps conscientious objections or actual pacifistic statements, but who have nevertheless talked about the undesirability of war. For example, you and I have talked in the past about my favorite author, who is the atheist and humanist, the late Isaac Asimov. And in his Foundation series, one of his heroic characters has a phrase that has always stuck with me. Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. And so, this hero in Asimov's science fiction universe who successfully guides his nation through two or three large scale crises over a period of public service of 30 or 40 years or so. His secret was that he always sought out a nonviolent resolution to an existential crisis over a violent solution. And that's pretty impressive at face value. And I don't want to minimize that. However, while I acknowledge that, I also recognize that there are groups of people for whom war has been a tool of policy. And let me be careful saying that because I'm going to later make the same claim, but I'm going to have a different idea about the policy there. There are people throughout history who used war as a means for economic improvement. Chuck, if I come up to your house and you come out to meet me and greet me and welcome me into your house, and I come up with me and 16 of my buddies in a SWAT team, and we forcibly take you away, and I come and I take all your stuff. I suppose in some minds that's economic policy, right? Now your stuff is mine. And we have examples in history of people who have been that blunt and that direct about the use of force. And so while I really respect the pacifistic position, I grew up in an area where there are a lot of Amish and Mennonites, for example, and many of them are conscientious objectors. And so while I admire the nobility of that, I also see a world that has fallen into sin. And as part of that sinfulness, war is a situation that many of us may have to face, whether we like it or not. And in fact, there is a famous verse, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. Here's my favorite one, Chuck: a time to scatter stones, and a time to gather them. And then, of course, a time for war and a time for peace. And if I'm following the scriptures, war is not necessarily something to be desired, but at the same point in time, it also just is. It's a part of this world, and to not want to participate in that in a godly way would be, I think, like me trying to say I'm against death and I'm going to be a conscientious objector to death. And then at the end of my life, suppose that my conscientious objection means anything in light of my coming demise. And so that's the world we live in, and that's where I come at it here. The medievals, by and large, had a world that was perhaps much closer than many of us face today. But Chuck, that's actually changing. You and I, and many people in Western societies, primarily, not exclusively, have had the benefit of a peace dividend for 70, almost 80 years. And now we see, for example, there's a conflict right now happening. It's across the world from us, but that doesn't mean that it's not close in other ways. And taking a look and being an observer during this conflict between Ukraine and Russia has to wrestle with this. And sometimes simple answers don't really do it justice. And I think that's what we're going to find with a lot of the medievals here. So before we get into maybe thinking about the medievals, maybe asking you to pick or take sides on the current conflict, but maybe how has that maybe played a part in your thoughts or in the application of what ought to be wholesome principles in this time?